Welcome to Chateau de Carneville. My name is Guillaume Garbe. I'm the happy owner-manager of this lovely house behind you, which we're going to visit together today. We will talk a little about its history, which is important, and there are plenty of historical anecdotes, and from an architectural point of view, some things that are really worth noting. Some beautiful decorations, as we still have all the 18th century salons on the first floor of the east wing, with a special feature in the form of intermediate floors, the equivalent, one might say, of a private mansion included in the chateau. We're going to take a look at some of areas which are actually undergoing a great deal of work, since we've just had to fight off an invasion of dry rot, a wood-eating fungus. The fungus covered more than 1,000 square meters. When we do things in Carneville, we do them well. So when we have a fungus, we go for 1,000 square meters. But it's not just these aspects that we're going to talk about together today. It's also the project to revitalize a rural historic monument. The Chateau de Carneville is a place where, together with the entire chateau team that we'll be talking about, we are firmly committed to maintaining the legitimacy of the pride that people have for the small rural heritage. It's our mission to give the place a future by raising public awareness as much as possible. It's been quite a journey, quite a life project, and many of us are invested in it. Now, what I propose is that we start the tour. So today is a day when the park is closed to the public, when there's no tourist activity, and yet the place doesn't come to a standstill. There's always plenty going on, and right now we're in the middle of preparing the village party with the Carneville Village Festivities Committee. And now we're entering inside the house. The first room is the entrance hall, which immediately sets the tone for the house's recent history. Its heritage, of course, with a few pieces of furniture that have been put back in place, like this lantern that was there before we arrived, a Louis XVI ram's head lantern, or the Louis XV hunting table just behind it. But we can also see that some plasterwork is missing, and even pieces of flooring. That's another aspect we can discuss. But the work we undertook was far from neutral for the identity of this house, but also for its future. So after the entrance hall, we arrive in the buffet room. In fact, Carneville's plan is a massed plan, i.e. double in depth. You could say you have the equivalent of 3 facades, the facade facing the courtyard on the southwest side, the facade facing the garden on the northeast side. And the house is bisected by what might be called a third facade, in the direction of the roof ridge, which divides the house with the garden on one side for the reception area, with a series of large reception rooms with French circulation and 4.5-meter ceilings. And there's also an intimate living area on the courtyard side, facing the sun. So these are very pleasant, very bright apartments that also overlook the activity of the outbuilding's courtyard. In the 18th century, when there was a reception, the buffet room was generally the first room people entered, and it was often where the most beautiful furniture was displayed. So the notion of furniture is a little problematic in Carneville, since we had to finance a huge building project and therefore sell off a lot of what we had. But what really marks the success of this project, and after 12 years of taking over this monument, I think we can legitimately start talking about success, is the enormous synergy that has been created around the monument. And there are many examples of this. For example, when we give guided tours of the chateau's interior, there's a lot of furniture in place. And this furniture has either been entrusted to us, lent to us, or given to us as a gift. For example, this model of the Royal Sun, the flagship of Louis XIV's fleet, has been placed right in the middle of the French-style perspective as you walk down the avenue. The boat is right in line with the doors of the central pavilion, and at the end of the garden there's a view of the sea. As you go down the avenue, there comes a point where the keel of the boat rests on the horizon of the sea. So, in image and poetry, it's pretty, but in symbol too, since this boat has passed 3 times right at the end of the park, and ended its life in Cherbourg Harbor, where it sank and is still there. As I was saying, the buffet room is the first room you enter. In other words, it's the hub of the house. You could almost think of it as the antechamber to the house, or the antechamber to the garden. From here, there is this series of enfilade salons. If we start with the west wing, we realize that there are still a few scars from the dry rot treatment, but we're not giving up. We're really proud to be able to say today that dry rot is part of the history of this monument. And so what we're committed to now and in the future is getting it back under control. And so here we are in the former music room, half of which was destroyed. It's actually quite surprising when you look at the Versailles parquet on the floor. There's a great straight line that cuts the room diagonally. So, in the life of the house, different opportunities have opened up for us. And I'm realizing after 12 years that all the things that moved us forward were not necessarily the things we determined, but rather the opportunities we gave ourselves over to. In other words, an encounter, a goal. And in the case of this room, 2 months ago, I would have been told that this was the first project you'd undertaken the chateau under restoration. I wouldn't have believed it at all. I think it would have been more of an apartment for me, to be honest. But it turns out that for almost 2 years, we've been working on purchasing a collection of historical memorabilia from the Chateau de Carneville family, the Comtel family who built the chateau. This collection includes 7 portraits, including the son of the castle's builder and his descendants, but also an extremely interesting archive and various historical testimonies. And so, with the Association des Amis du Chateau de Carneville, which has acquired this collection, we are in the process of restoring this room so as to be able to set up the collection and really present a concrete part of the history of this house, but also by embodying it. By showing them that, by showing visitors and anyone interested in coming to discover this place, that the history of this kind of house isn't just portraits of people with powdered wigs, but it's people like us who have given their whole lives to this place. At Carneville, we've done the math. We're the 16th generation to run the estate. The first building was constructed in the year of the house. And that's quite humbling, because in fact, all that energy, which is new for us since it's our life's journey, all the energy we give. But it's since the construction of the house that people have been giving it here. So what we're doing as the 16th generation is doing everything we can to preserve as much of the historical evidence that are visible today so that we can, in the 17th generation, pass on a monument that has these same historical testimonies. This, I would say, depends on the responsibility of an owner-manager, not only in terms of heritage restoration, but also in terms of preserving the common good. No intervention on a historic monument is inconsistent, so we have to define the project carefully with historical diagnoses, surrounding ourselves with architects and people who are able to give an opinion and carry out research, especially as the project we have embarked on is not just a sanitary project, but also a restoration project. We'll talk more about that later. Right now, I'd like to take you into the rooms that have retained their original decor. So, if you leave the music room, you can go to the other side of the hallway, where you arrive in a large dining room. In the archives, and in particular in the predeceased inventories, we haven't yet been able to determine the precise use of this room in the 18th century. According to the canonical plan, the ideal plan, it corresponds to a bedroom. But the floor is paved with stone, an extremely interesting type of stone. It's Yvetot Bocage stone, an extremely hard limestone, which is very good for floors that are subject to regular foot traffic, and it has blue veins, reminiscent of the color of the blue shale we have on the roof. And some of the fireplaces in the house too have been sculpted, following the bluish veins which themselves serve as ornaments and supports for the sculptures. That's upstairs, we'll see later. So, in this dining room we can make a small point about the dry rot. As we often say with the Chateau team, in this house we have a lucky star. We don't yet know which galaxies we're in, but we do have a lucky star. So, the construction of the chateau began around 1740, and the family's first move-in is thought to have been around 1755. The chateau is finished, enclosed and covered, but not yet decorated. There's really the first floor of the east wing, this room, and the others we'll discover after, which have all their original decor. The family left at the time of the French Revolution, went into exile in Bavaria, and the eldest branch returned in 1810 and refurbished the interior a little. And it turns out today, now that the dry rot treatment work site has been completed, so we can say precisely what we had to destroy and what we were able to keep, we realized that the 3 most beautiful rooms in the chateau are the only 3 rooms in the house that didn't suffer from dry rot. So we're able to show you the wood panels and even the doors. Look, all the doors still have their original little olivettes with the original locks. Nothing has changed. You could say if you forget the dry rot factor, which is a real challenge, it's a real jewel, a house in extraordinary condition. So it's full of little surprises too, notably the furious modernity of the exterior architecture, which we'll be able to talk about a little when we see the house from the garden. In contrast, the interior decor are rather classical, but that's explained by the location of this house. We're on the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula. As I often say, we have the sea on three sides and are cut off by the tides. It's really an island, we call it the Presqu'île, but you could almost say that the locals are islanders. And so when you look at the decor program for this room, it's very Louis XIII, even Louis XIV, even though we're in the 1750s. Quite simply, it's the local cabinet maker who worked as he knew how, as his father or grandfather taught him to do. So we have 3/3 divisions on the heights. On the widths, we have gendarme hat motifs at the top of the woodwork. On the other hand, a few small motifs, really Louis XV, just scattered around are there. This is simply because the woodworker must have leafed through manuals such as Roubaud, which are carpentry books, or must have seen illustrations somewhere at the time, and so adopted elements of contemporary ornamentation, integrating them into a working technique he had mastered. If we look, for example, at the top of the door patterns, which are quite ornate, or the curled acanthus leaves on the ceilings, we are clearly dealing with a decorative scheme that is almost 100 years out of date. It's like building a cube house today and furnishing it entirely with vintage furniture. Yes, maybe it's not as incongruous as all that. Yes, there are people who do that too, but you see, we're doing what we did in the 18th century. We're combining extremely modern things and things that are reassuring by tradition. One of the surprises in the design is the hidden passageways that lead from the main reception area to the private apartments. A hidden passage is not a secret passage, of course. Let's say you're curious in the 18th century, you want to push open the door and say to yourself, you've stumbled upon a closet. We know very well that there is a good chance the back of the closet is hollow, which it is. So we pull the back of the closet and find ourselves in another closet. And now I suggest you follow me into this second closet. Because when you go to the left, it always sounds hollow, and you arrive in the intermediate floor apartments. Contrary to what you might imagine when you arrive from the main avenue and look at the facade in the main courtyard, this part of the house on the east wing has 6 floors. You have the basement floor, with ceilings almost 5 meters high, this intermediate floor with the small alcove bedroom here. Above that, you have the apartment of the Countess of Carneville's lady-in-waiting, plus her wardrobe. Above that, you have the master bedrooms. Above that, the servants' bedrooms. And above that, the attic with more servants' bedrooms. So that's 6 floors for this house. I think one of the most touching things about the architecture of Carneville is that it's an extremely symmetrical house. So you can see it at a glance, you can understand it at a glance, but don't be fooled, because when you go inside, all our senses are lost and we find ourselves in a house that seems even bigger than the impression we had on arrival. Then, if you continue the tour, you'll come to the corner cabinet. So a room in the 18th century doesn't necessarily have a fixed use. Yes, a bedroom was a bedroom. Yes, a salon was a salon. But a dining room could be mobile, as could an office. And so when you read the pre-death inventories for this room, you realize that it's always referred to as a corner cabinet. Of course, a cabinet leaves the door open for any use, but why corner? Because we're on the corner of the house, exactly to the south of the chateau. It has a stone floor, not a wooden floor, which means it's not a bedroom or a room really dedicated to comfort. When you look at the pre-death inventories, you realize that this room can be used to set up a table and become a small dining room. Or if Madame de Carneville had correspondence to answer, a desk could be set up and she could put her letters there. Or if she wants to take a bath, this room becomes a bathroom. On the wall there, the picture hangs from a huge metal hook, which is a bath canopy hook. A bath canopy, you know, is a metal circle that you hang from. The bathtub was placed underneath and a curtain was placed on top of the metal circle. Then the tub was filled with extremely hot water. And the curtain that covers it is not so much to preserve a notion of intimacy, but rather to preserve the warmth of the water. You could almost call it a hammam. What's charming is that in each of these rooms, which have very low ceilings for comfort reasons, we're right in the path of the sun. So the slightest ray of sunlight, like today, makes the room extremely pleasant. All the windows have interior shutters, which is something you really find a lot of north of the Loire, for a very practical reason, and history often has to be looked at from a practical point of view and not fantasized about. If you put shutters outside, in the middle of winter, we spend our day heating the room. If you have to open the window wide to close the shutters, it's a real shame. On the other hand, if you have internal shutters, you can close them directly, lock them from inside, and you've maintained all the heat in the room. And this heat can be emitted by all the fireplaces. There are 27 in all in the house, which are of course all in proportion to the rooms. This one is particularly charming. Fireplaces are considered like furniture, with marble tops and limestone jambs made of Valognes stone, which is a historically important town for us, some 30 kilometers away. And also this Yvetot Bocage stone I mentioned earlier, which comes from approximately the same quarry, but has a much higher density, and those famous blue veins I told you about. So, for an anecdote about chimneys, which you'll find echoed above, when I arrived here 12 years ago, I wanted to light the fireplace fires, and it turned out to be impossible to unblock them with the chimney sweep from underneath, as the flues are quite tortuous. And the crows, or connels, as they say in our country, have filled the chimneys with a bunch of branches until they could build their nest at the top. So now we have 19 meters of branches. In the restoration project we undertook to save the main house, we scaffolded the rooftop chimneys to rebuild them, and so we thought it was an opportunity to bring back the roofer. To unblock the chimneys from above, impossible to unblock them from above. So, with the architect Arnaud Paquin, the heritage architect in charge of the house, we decided to examine all the partition walls, that is, the walls that make up the interior organization and the load-bearing walls, to find all the chimney flues within them. And we realized that there's a central heating system right from the house's 18th century design. For example, this little fireplace right here, or the one in the small living room we were in earlier. On the roof there's a chimney stack just above it. From a completely innocent point of view, you might think that if you light a fire here, it's going to smoke on top. Well, no, it's going to smoke on the northeast facade on the other side and at the west end, i.e. opposite the house. In fact, it turns out that all the chimney flues go through floors, go over doors. All of this demonstrates an absolutely incredible work by the fumiste. The fumiste is the person who has to position the chimney, calculate the size of the hearth according to its place in the room, taking into account the doors, windows, etc. And what's really wonderful is that when you light them, not only the hot fumes will purify the house all the way through the chateau, but they also fire extremely well. So now you're in front of your computer, you're not with us, but you're welcome, you can join us whenever you want. But you can feel it, you can smell it. There's no smell of humidity. And yet, this house hasn't been lived in for over 7 years. The architect and I selected certain fireplaces. When it is very cold in winter, we make a fire once a week using a wheelbarrow of wood per fireplace. When it is a bit less cold, we make a fire every 2 weeks. This helps maintain the inertia the house has gained during the summer, preventing it from entering the condensation phase. The condensation phase is the worst. It's when the house is colder than the outside and water starts to run everywhere. I remind you that we have fought against a problem of dry rot, a fungus that of course needs water. And a battle against dry rot is not just about saying we will solve the problem. No, the battle to be fought is to resolve the symbiosis that has been established between the fungus and the building. This means finding sources of humidity, ventilate, circulate light and air, and make sure that the environment doesn't redevelop and become a breeding ground for the fungus. I suggest we take a look at the damage it has done. Let's take a look at the back staircase, what used to be called a fond en comble. Why is this? Because it runs from the basement of the house to the roof. And it's actually, when we give guided tours, I like to draw little parallels like that with very concrete things today. And the famous expression, I've redone everything from top to bottom, or I've cleaned everything from top to bottom. In fact, that's really where it comes from. In other words, you start at the bottom of the house in the cellars and work your way up to the top. So as I was saying, it's a fake little house because to get up to the top, we have 6 floors to climb. So here we take the service staircase, the staircase from top to bottom. We don't take the grand staircase because it's made of wood, and I remind you that the dry rot has been there. So when you get upstairs, I'll close the door and you'll see the big corridor. In fact, this is what's interesting. is that the architect of the chateau is probably a military architect, a military engineer. The layout of the first floor is almost identical to that of a barracks, i.e. a large central corridor with rooms, apartments served from either side. Everything facing the southwest, i.e. the courtyard, was laid out in the 18th century. So we can go and have a look together. There are the famous Yvetot Bocage stone mantles with the blue veins. Look, they're not waxed. The house hasn't been lived in for 7 years now, and we intend to bring them back to life one day. But the blue veins follow the sculpted patterns. You've got over mantles, you've got low paneling. Don't forget that we're in a chateau on the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, so we're dealing with a rather rustic builder's family, even though the 18th century saw a rise in social status. In fact, the builder Charles-François Simon de Carneville was captain of the King's Coast Guard attached to the fort of Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue, a UNESCO site some 20 kilometers from here. With Vauban Towers, he had the chateau built to truly anchor this social ascension in his fiefdom. They became confidants of the Comte d'Artois and others, Louis XVI's brother. They were initially a very rustic family from the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, but they really expanded. The son of the chateau's builder married the daughter of the Prince of Lichnowsky, an extremely important Austrian family. The second manor house, a seigneurial dwelling dating from 1637, was far too rustic. At the time, it wasn't good enough, so he decided to build a chateau. But we didn't go for a chateau with ornamentation everywhere, with mascarons above every window, or with absolutely extraordinary woodwork in the bedrooms. No, it's in keeping with the identity of our region. Of course, there's a fireplace, low wainscoting, probably some fabric stretched on the walls, and that's all. It's not in this kind of house that you'd find gilded wood furniture or a whole bunch of ornamental furnishings that don't match the character of Cotentin buildings. So you get a glimpse here, we'll develop it further, but in reality, along the entire southwest facade, we had to insulate the floors from the facade. So here, it's very measured, about 50 centimeters. This is not good for us because the joists are cut very short, so we'll have to replace them entirely even if only 50 centimeters are missing. But you'll see that on the other part of the house, we're looking at about 1 to 1.5 meters of floor insulation on the facade. You have to imagine that a house with a floor area of around 1,400 square meters and is hit by a fungus that covers more than 1,000 square meters, not just in terms of floor area, but also including walls, etc., means that a good 2/3 of the house is under attack. So, as part of this work management process, I propose that we quickly move up to the attics. Of course, when you're talking about dry rot and you know that it eats wood right away on a frame, there's a lot to fear. But it turns out that when we assessed the site, we realized that we could preserve more than 19% of the original framework. I'm going to show you the work that's been done, which I find really beautiful in terms of quality, which of course preserves know-how, but it also allows us to be much more confident about this house for the next century. So here we are in the servants' quarters on the second to last floor of the house. In fact, about 1/3 of the house is arranged with servants' rooms on each side, which are of course separate from the butler's apartment, which is in the basement of the chateau with a lovely stucco fireplace and so on. Once through the first third, we arrive here in the central part. In fact, we can see the ridge beam attachments of the pediments in the roof structure. You have the northeast one on the garden side to my right, and the very interesting one is on the southwest side, where we really see the continuation of various works, and one of the main points of fungal attack was on this part. As a result, how do you go from 4.5 meters under the ceiling to over 12 meters? With a little dry rot, you can do it. When you look down here, you've got a direct view of the entrance hall. Now I suggest we take a little tour of the garden. There are 30 hectares of land surrounding the estate. It's very hilly, very landscaped. Of the 30 hectares, there are 21 hectares of meadows and 7 hectares of parkland open to the public. There's also a rather interesting wooded area with biotopes that are still very healthy, and that's one of the levers we're paying a lot of attention to. So, To get a complete overview of the park, you'll have to come and see us. We can't show you the diversity of the landscape in a few dozen minutes. However, there is one thing I'd really like to show you today. It's the very beginning of May, and you should know that the Cotentin region is ideal for gardens, as it's an extremely temperate area. It's extremely rare for us to reach 0 degrees in winter, but equally rare for us to exceed 25-27 degrees in summer. This allows us to acclimatize many different plant species, but also allows us to experiment. In May is the best time to discover all the flowering plants of what we call the laurel family. These include azaleas, prices, and rhododendrons. Here, the rhododendron we're heading for is monumental. You can go under it. It has an extraordinarily graphical trunk, and today it's in full bloom. Why do I want to show you these rhododendrons in particular? Well, they're called rhododendron alopeanum, or more popularly, rhodo de Cherbourg. Let me remind you that Carneville is about 15 kilometers east of Cherbourg. At the end of the 19th century, there was a horticultural society organized by Emmanuel Lié. Today, in the center of Cherbourg, there is still a botanical park and an extraordinary natural history museum named after Emmanuel Lié, since these were his personal collections. Among the horticultural society was a certain Monsieur Allopey, who patented a rhododendron plant he had invented. This rhododendron is truly exuberant in its flowering and also in its scent, a rare thing for a rhododendron. For the record, it was patented and presented at the Liège World's Fair in 1933. The English, who really liked the plant, decided to take cuttings from it and market it under a different name. As you can imagine, this didn't please Monsieur Allopey at all. Legal proceedings were initiated and the rights were finally returned to Mr. Allopey's descendants. Today, Alopeanum rhododendron plants are back on the market. You could say that after 50 years or so, you start to have a fairly substantial rhododendron plant. But the advantage of this particular plant is that it was planted at the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, so its dimensions are absolutely breathtaking. Here we're really in the extension of the avenue up which everyone arrives today. And so when I was talking about the winter solstice, imagine a December 21st, with the house against the light and the strength of the luminosity coming from behind, and the sun just coming out of the central pavilion. This is where we almost touch, I'd say in a tangible way, to a certain sacredness of a historic monument. When we host school outings, for example, or childcare centers, the main thing I try to develop with the children is that if you find a place pretty, it's not just due to one thing. It's not just the architect's work, it's because the architect worked with the landscaper, who worked with the topographer, who worked with the craftsman, and it's all this synergy, all this intention to create a pretty place that makes us really appreciate it today. And it's in this faithful perspective that we're committing ourselves today to a federation for the future of this monument. The future of this monument. So here we are in the rose garden and the little English-style grove that's just over there. So as soon as we get there, it's really well thought out from a landscaping point of view, since we have this incredible polychromy between the rhododendron flowers, the purple beech just above, the blue cedar at the back, and a head of Austrian panois that we'll see popping up from the very top. Interestingly, all the trees in front of the rhododendrons and flowering trees are varieties of maple that leaf out extremely late, so all these flowering groves can be seen from the chateau's salons right up to the end of the blooming season. And here we are in front of the rhododendron alopeanum. So just to give you an idea, I'm almost 1.90 meters. It's a tree that provides an enormous amount of pollen and juices, and when you get up close, there's a buzz of insects that's absolutely incredible in this tree. So this gives me a chance to tell you a little about the dynamics involved in maintaining the estate, not just the park, but also the 30 hectares, since the land is free and all of it is dependent on the chateau. We are trying to apply an eco-management plan in collaboration with the Association of Friends of the Chateau and other partners. Within the association, we have mycologists specializing in mushrooms, ornithologists specializing in birds, entomologists specializing in insects, and in particular one specializing in moths and another in bees. Together, we regularly carry out inventories and surveys. This enables us to get to know the park better and better, and our desire for the next 30-40 years is not to force the park to meet our objectives, but to adapt our objectives to the identity of this place by preserving as much as possible the notion of landscape, since there is the part of the park beyond the land, but also by preserving the rich diversity of these biotopes. Alternation between wetlands, drylands, deep soil, i.e. with a rather deep bedrock, or on the plateau with a very outcropping bedrock, i.e. with a soil that doesn't retain water at all in the same way, so will have other vegetation. Leaving the grasses tall will bring back the prairie birds. The whole dynamic we've been putting in place over the last 12 years is having a real impact today, thanks to the monitoring of inventories. And it's an absolutely incredible dose of hope. It's where you realize how resilient and life-giving nature can be, just when you let it be. And you're there just to value it, not to revolutionize it, but to integrate into its rhythm and make the most of it. Come on, I can't resist the urge to show you the little flower labyrinth where we'll be ricocheting from rhododendron to azalea, where they have different flowering rhythms, some taking their flowers before the others, where we can have rhododendrons of a very primary variety, the rhodoponticum, which is the equivalent of a wild rhodo, but where we can have much more botanical varieties, where the shape of the flower and its color will be achieved through a whole series of trials and crossbreeding, and after a while we manage to find a plant that becomes stable and can actually develop its full character. Then there's the rhythm of flowering. We have camellias, which are more likely to bloom during the winter. We have this series of rhododendrons and azaleas, where we come across different shapes, and in particular a tree that's starting to look very pretty, a shrubby azalea, which has some absolutely incredible colors, a fluorescent orange like this one, where we can have both a flower shape and a scent that's really fantastic. And diversity all the way. You see, next to an azalea, you'll find a pepper plant, a Tasmania, and each grove over the 7 hectares will have its own particularities, its own intentions, its own geographical categories of acclimatization. And it's by taking a tour, the whole estate, that you can really get a feel for it. And I could conclude by saying that if a historic monument also has a responsibility, it's to address young people. And from an educational point of view, we host many school outings and organize various activities, such as specialized guided tours for children, followed by workshops, etc. One of the things we recently implemented is a visit booklet, which invites the children to go on a treasure hunt. They follow a route through the buildings and the park, ultimately realizing that the treasure they are meant to discover at Carneville is not a chest filled with coins, but the place itself.
Le trésor, c'est l'endroit, c'est le lieu.
So you're welcome to come and discover this treasure with us.